All right, we're moving on to day 3 of the boot camp here. It's Wednesday, June 5th, and what we're going to do today is we're just going to keep on rolling with the content, going straight to the overview. As we go through the class, we're going to get fewer and fewer elements over here each week because the elements just get bigger. So in the previous weeks, we've had a whole lot of bullet points to get through. Today we just have really two primary things. We have conditional statements and then other types of iteration concepts. So conditional statements, if you look over here, it's if else, if elif, and if elif else. Elif is just short for else if. Other programming languages write out else if, but Python has shortened it to elif. But we're going to talk about all of this as we go through. And again, for some of you who are really familiar with coding, this might not be that exciting for you, but it is looking at some of the formatting associated with Python. So, a conditional statement is used to handle conditions in your program. So anything that you have a choice, right? If your program is making a decision, it's usually doing it through a conditional statement. Now, with conditional statements, they use a Boolean value, and we know that Boolean values can only be true or false. Since they can only be true or false, then every conditional statement at its core can only have two different options. It's a lot like a flowchart where it's a yes or a no, and then you just move through the flowchart. It can only have two options. Sometimes there are other conditions where you can have more than two, but the ones we're going to talk about today only have two options because they're all using a Boolean value. So these statements are really what make your program work. It's still linear, step by step, but the decision-making process happens because of conditional statements. So the if statement, this is just the general formatting. Right, we'll talk a little bit about what it does as we go, but the if statement says here, if the sun is red, then blood has been spilled this night. And that's how we read an if statement. This is if this condition, everything inside the parentheses, this is the Boolean expression that we talked about a couple of sessions ago. The Boolean expression can only return true or false. So, is the sun red? If it is, then print blood has been spilled this night. If it is not, if this returns false, then it just skips this whole block of code right here. The print code never happens in the event that this is false. So a standard if statement, it either returns true or false. When it returns true, the block of code that is inside the if statement, and remember when we talk about blocks of code, that's everything that's tabbed out. My example here only has one line in the block, but you could have as many lines as you want as long as they matched up with this spacing. It would happen inside of the if statement. So when it's true, it runs the event. When it's not true, it skips the event. And that's the core element of an if statement. It checks one line and decides if it wants to run the next set of lines. So we talk about the formatting. And this is just a little bit more detail. But one thing I do want to say is every time we're using a comparison, we're still using that double equals. And remember, we talked about that. A regular equals is assigning value, but a double equals is comparing values. And it's always a Boolean operation inside of the if statement. So you have the condition, and then you have the event. So this is a little bit more detailed slide. Probably should have started on this one. So the condition, sun equals red. The event is a print out to the console, blood has been spilled this night. That's the if statement. Now the if statement can be expanded to have an else statement. So I told you before, there's the condition and then there's the event. And the event only happens if the condition is true. But then what happens if the condition is false? Well, in this example, if the condition is false, then it just skips this whole block of code and it never happens. In this example, when this condition is false, it skips the whole block of code, but then it goes to the next line, which is an else statement. And the else statement tells the program what to do in the event that this condition is false. So again, this is the condition. If the actor is Nicolas Cage, the event is it's a bad movie. The else happens when the actor is not Nicolas Cage, and then the event is it might be a good movie. This condition determines which one of these blocks to go through, and the else allows us to have an option for the false. Without this else statement, when the condition is false, nothing happens. The else allows us to have a alternate event or a secondary event for when the condition is false. And again, this is the format of it. One thing I didn't mention previously is the format of an if statement. You start with if, obviously. You have the condition. And in both examples, I think I've used an equals sign, but all of the operators that we talked about, you could have greater than or less than, greater than or equal to, not equal to. All of those work because we're just creating a Boolean expression. So if you're using numerals, integers or floats, then you could use the greater than, less than examples. But I'm using strings because I'm using strings. The last part of an if statement is you have to have this colon here. In a lot of other programming languages, you're going to have brackets, an open and a close bracket. Python simplified that by using the spacing and the colon. So the colon kind of works as the same as an open bracket or an open brace in another programming language. And then the closing brace would be the removing of the tab spacing. And that's just the format of the if statement. So this is an if and an else. If you remember back from the overview, there's another option. There's an elif. And this represents an else if statement. And again, it's just shortened. In Python, other languages, it actually would write else if, but in Python it's shorter. And it's because it's really commonly used, right? It's just shorthand. But it functions similarly to the else statement, is that this line only happens when this condition is false. So the condition is if the character is Samwise Gamgee, then you keep your promises. As long as this is true, then you keep your promises. And when this is true, it skips the entire else statement. When this condition is true, the else statement never happens. When this is false, it jumps down to the else statement. And then it has a secondary condition, or a new condition. In the event that the character is not Samwise Gamgee, then you check the elif, and if the character is Rose, then you let Jack drown. Now you could have an elif for thousands of characters here to see what they would do, right? But in this instance, the if, the main condition, the primary event, the secondary condition, and the secondary event. So these happen in order. The Python always reads from top to bottom. So it's evaluating this condition. In the event that this condition is true, it's evaluating this event. If this condition is false, then it's jumping down to the else statement. It's seeing that there is a second condition, and then it's evaluating that condition. In the event that neither of these two conditions are true, then it's going to skip out and neither of the events will happen, and it will just move on with your program. So that's if, else, and elif. Now you could have if, elif, else if you wanted. You can have as many of these as you want in a line, but generally when you have an else statement and it's just an else, that's going to be the end of your if statement, the end of your conditions, because there's nothing that can happen after that. So you can have as many elifs as you want. You can have 700 of them. It doesn't matter. But once you get to else and there's no elif, this is the end of the cycle, I guess, the end of the conditional. So when we talked about Boolean operators, we did talk about and or. And so when we talk about multiple conditional statements, then all that means is you can have more than one condition inside the Boolean expression. And we've already talked about that a little bit, but it's important to understand that you can apply that to an if statement. You can also apply it to a while loop when we get down, and we talk about a while loop here probably in the next video. But this is an example of multiple conditional statements, and this is an example of multiple conditions, right? There's 4, 5 conditions here. All of them are OR conditions, so in order for this Boolean operation to represent as true, just one of these conditions has to be true. But again, once you get down to the else statement, then that's kind of the end of the loop. So if both of these conditions are true, condition 1 and condition 2, then it's going to run this event. If even one of these is not true, it's going to jump down to the else if statement, or the elif, and evaluate all of these conditions. If even one of these conditions is true, it's going to run the secondary event. If all of these conditions are false, then it's going to run the tertiary event here. And there's a lot to talk about conditional statements, and we make conditional trees or tables, make conditional tables for what will happen and when things will run. We're not worried about that just now. Right now we're worried about the fact that you can create conditional statements. The last conditional idea I want to talk about is a nested conditional statement. So a nested statement is just one that sits inside of another statement. So sometimes these operate similarly to a multiple conditional statement, but they have a little bit more flexibility. So in this, you have if condition 1, when this is true, it's going to check to see if condition 2 is true. When condition 2 is true, it's going to check to see if condition 3 is true. When condition 3 is true, it's going to run the event. Now, this example is the exact same as this example, because in order to get to this event, all 3 of these conditions have to be true. Right? So it's the exact same, but it's written a different way. And you can nest as many as you want, but the benefit of nesting, as opposed to using the multiple conditions, is you could have an event that runs after condition 1 is true and before you check if condition 2 is true. You could have another event that runs after condition 2 before you check for condition 3, and then you could have this event. You could also have an else if, or an elif, or an else that is attached to each one of these if statements. And I didn't put that in, but we'll write that when we get to the coding, just to show you what it looks like. But an else that goes right here would be attached only to this if statement. An else that goes in this would be attached only to this if statement. And this is where the spacing really matters, right? Because the else has to line up with the if statement that it's countering, or that it's running the false condition. In the multiple, you don't have to worry so much about that because you're only going to have one else. But the conditional statements, the nested statements, just are more flexible. But sometimes they're harder to read and harder to understand exactly where things are going. It gets really messy when you have a whole bunch of else ifs and elses that are attached to 3 or 4 different if statements. But sometimes that's what you need, so that's what you end up with. I've only got a couple of minutes left on the video. I don't know that I have time to get through the whole next session, so I'm going to go ahead and pause it here, and we will see you in the next video. So thanks, everybody.